Okay, welcome to Virtually Golden, presented by Golden United. Today we have Barb Warden presenting for us. Barb Warden runs the website Golden Today and is the author of the daily email What's Happening in Golden, which often delves into obscure parts of Golden history. For her work with that site, she has received the Golden Chamber's Civic Award, the Golden Mayor's Award, and the Golden Landmark Association's Living Landmarks Award. She is also a past president of Leadership Golden and one of the founders of the Golden Beer Talks. Barb is the author of 3 books about Golden, including Funiculars of Golden, Colorado, and she teaches a Golden history class through OLLI and is a frequent guest lecturer and tour guide on Golden history topics. Today, Barb is going to be talking about the history of Golden, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Barb.
Well, thank you, Annie. Okay, so I'm going to begin by talking about the very beginnings of Golden after white settlement, because frankly, I don't know that much about Paleolithic Golden or Golden during the American Indian era, and I hope we can get a different speaker who will discuss that. But I'm going to talk about Golden beginning with the gold rush. In 1858, gold was discovered in Colorado, and surprisingly quickly, the word flew back across the country and word got out and thousands of people began to stampede to Colorado, including some people who wound up here in Golden. And there are certain universal truths that everyone going into a gold rush knows about. They all know that gold is going to be everywhere on the ground, in the streams, probably growing from the trees, and you can just pick it up and then you can, take a bag full of gold home and you will be rich for the rest of your lives. That's what everyone thinks when they come out to a gold rush. That's not always the case. In fact, far more people go home poor than go home rich, and some of them never go home at all. But there had been a gold rush just 10 years before in California, the 1849 gold rush. A lot of those same people went from California to Colorado to participate in our gold rush. A lot of the people who founded Golden had learned in that 1849 gold rush that the people who really get rich, or at least more reliably rich, are the ones who sell things to the miners rather than the people who come out here depending on getting rich through gold. They found that food, clothing, and shelter were very hard to come by in a mining area, and they're very expensive. And so, let's see. There we go. Our first resident was David Wall. He came out here in the spring of 1859, and he planted a garden because he knew that the food in a gold rush area was very hard to come by. What most people were eating was the food they were able to bring themselves, and that was highly preserved or like naturally preserved stuff like dried beans. And the only meat that you could really travel with was called fat salt pork. And so most people lived on a diet of a sort of cornbread and beans and fat salt pork, which is similar to bacon, only it's even slimier and fattier than bacon is. So that was the diet. So David Wall knew that people were going to be craving some fresh food. So while many people who wanted to be suppliers came out here with a wagon load full of supplies that they could sell, David Wall came out with a wagon load full of garden seeds. And he built a garden near what we now call Tucker Gulch, kind of the area that we also now call Goosetown. And in his first year, he was so bright about how valuable fresh produce would be to people that in his first year he made $2,000 from his garden, and that is way more than most of the prospectors made from their gardens, made from their prospecting. Sorry. So David Wall, by some, is called the father of Colorado agriculture, And he is also called the father of Colorado's irrigation because he built a little trench, a ditch, coming over from Tucker Gulch and leading into his garden. And that's how he watered his garden. So if he had cared to stay with it, David Wall could have had the oldest water rights in the state of Colorado. However, after 2 years of producing garden stuff and making quite a lot of money in that, he went on to other things and invested in other lines of work. But some of our earliest businesses in this area were in fact ditches, irrigation, channeling water from a place like Clear Creek or Bear Creek or some other source of water over to a place where it could be used to grow things. So this is an early drawing of probably Welch Ditch because it looks like we're on the south side of the creek. And that was being used to water gardens. Another one of our very early settlers, he got here in, I believe, June of 1859, was William Loveland. And that's Loveland as in the town of Loveland and Loveland Pass. And he was just a huge promoter of Golden, and he's probably the reason we still exist. Loveland came out intending to start a store. And in fact, let's see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this is his store. This is Cheney's Saloon was at about the corner of 11th and Washington, and Loveland's store was right next to it. In fact, there's a blank space between buildings now that the Golden Gardeners have planted a little bit of a garden in, and they actually call it Loveland Gardens because that's approximately the place where Loveland's store was. And Loveland was a veteran of the Mexican-American War. He had been wounded in the war and walked with a limp for the rest of his life, which becomes important later when I talk about the Civil War. But he was a businessman, and he knew that there was going to be much demand for goods. So he came out with a wagon train full of wagons full of goods. Another very early settler was George West. And he also came out with a group of friends that called themselves the Boston Company, and they had a wagon train full of goods. And I'm not sure it was his intention to be a long-term storekeeper, but he knew that there was going to be demand for goods and that selling things would fund his future ventures. So he built a store in what we now call Banneker Park on the north side of the creek. At the same time, Loveland was building his store on the south side of the creek. And the two of them were, well, let me just say, people who like Golden history really like George West. There are many reasons for that. He was a really good storyteller, and he put a lot of his stories in writing. He was the one who started the Western Mountaineer newspaper and then later started the Colorado Transcript, which is now the Golden Transcript. And that's where I spent a lot of my waking hours is reading his old newspapers. So he was a good storyteller, and he's the reason we know so much about Golden history. But the thing about George West stories is that they're all, well, they're funny. They're more concerned maybe with telling a good story than with being factually accurate. And so here is one of the famous George West stories. He and Loveland were competing to see who would have the honor of building the first store building, to see who could finish their store building first. And so they were in a dead heat, and day after day they built up, and first story and then their second story. And then they got to the point where they were ready to roof their buildings. And George West and his friends in the Boston Company went to bed content because they knew they had shingles and Loveland didn't. So they knew that the next day they were going to get up and put on their roof and then they would win. However, they got up the next morning and they found that all of their shingles were gone, but Loveland had a roof. So a characteristic of a George West story is that it always ends with people drinking together. So the happy ending of that story about the competition over the roof was that later in the day, Loveland brought over a cask of whiskey, and they all drank whiskey, and so all was forgiven, and they all had a good time. all of his stories always end with people drinking together. Oh, there it is, Western Mountaineer. For about a year, he started in a newspaper before the Civil War, and then decided that there really wasn't enough of a community here to support a newspaper. So it only ran for about a year, but even that is available online, and so we can find out what was happening here in 1860. So one of the challenges of trying to run a store during the gold rush, during a time when there was no good transportation, like there was no railroad here, was that it was very difficult to get and maintain inventory. I mentioned that they both came across the plains with wagons full of goods, but what happens after you've sold the stuff and you're out of goods? You know, it takes 6 weeks to get back to, well, like St. Joseph, Missouri, which is kind of the last spot of civilization and the point from which many of them took off. And so it takes that long to go restock. So I don't know if you can fully see it, but there's an ad here from Loveland's store, and it's very specific about the things they carry, about the kind of dishes they carry, and you can't really see it, but one of the things they say on this ad is they have boots. And the reason they would be so specific about what they had was that you really couldn't count on a store, any store in the Gold Rush area, having boots. And so you would advertise it if you did, and people would come from all around because they knew there was a place they could get boots. So it was just very hard to get, to maintain these stores, which is one of the reasons they were able to charge high prices for what they did have, and one of the reasons early storekeepers were able to amass a tidy little fortune of their own. This is Washington Avenue in this picture, by the way. And again, if you can see my cursor, this down here is Loveland's first store. Another challenge is that there was no law here. This area had been completely uninhabited except by Native Americans, but uninhabited by white folks until 1859. And there was no government, there were no sheriffs or police or marshals. There was no one to take care of the law. And Golden was a violent place. The kind of people who come out to a gold rush tend to be young men, quick to be excited at the thought of going on an adventure, and quick to be irritated and bored when the adventure doesn't play out. And most people really didn't find significant gold, so they had a lot of reason to be bored and irritated. One of the few really thriving businesses was the saloon business. And just about every place in town was selling liquor. So there was a lot of lawlessness, a lot of drunkenness, a lot of irritated young people running around, challenging each other to duels and shooting off their pistols and stuff. And there was one particular night that has been chronicled. I think it was probably more common than we're aware of, that people were going around shooting each other, but there was this one particular night. There was a guy who owned half of one of these saloons in town, and he sold out his half to his partner, and so he had a little cash in his pocket. And so right away he started drinking up his proceeds, and drank and drank. And the guy was known to be a fairly rational and pleasant individual when he was sober, but he was known to be a mean drunk. And so he was getting drunk that day, and he started shooting his gun. And, you know, in some cases he would aim it right at somebody and still miss. So fortunately he was not successful in aiming his gun, but he started to swear that before the day was out, he was going to kill somebody. And people believed him. He went around and was shooting in all the saloons, went from place to place. When he got too drunk to load his gun anymore, because he just couldn't get those bullets in there, he couldn't aim well enough, he stole a Bowie knife from somebody, and so he was going around threatening people with the knife. And he said again and again, "I'm going to kill somebody before this day is out." And so the crowd, the community, such as it was at the time, got together and thought, well, what are we going to do about this guy? He says he's going to kill somebody, and he's a terrible marksman, but surely eventually he will succeed in killing somebody. And so they sort of gathered up into an informal posse, and they chased him down, and he hid in a house that was on 12th Street, right about where Tributary Food Hall is now. And so the crowd gathered around that house, and they were discussing what they were going to do, and they, should we take him out and punish him? They used to whip people as a form of, corporal punishment and to discourage them from bad acts. Or, should we just ban him from town, tell him you have to leave and never show your face here again? Or should we just kill him? Because that way we know he won't go around and try to kill somebody. And they voted to kill him. So they told him to come out of the house, and surprisingly he did. And they said, "Hold out your hands, we're going to tie you up." And he did. He held out his hands, they tied him up, and then they marched him down 12th Street over to Ford Street. They crossed the bridge, and they stopped in the area that's a park now, right beyond the bridge. And there was an old beef gallows there that they'd used for butchering cattle. And they put a noose around his neck, and they threw it over the beef gallows, the gallows. And, this isn't like in a Western movie where there's a sudden drop that breaks people's necks. There wasn't that much of a drop, but the crowd seized hold of that rope, and they pulled until he was dead. So they killed him, and 150 years later, we named the park after him. The Banneker Park is named for Edgar Vanover, who was the guy who was killed there. So Golden may be unique in having a city park named after somebody that the Golden community decided to lynch. By 1861, the easy to get gold, the stuff that had been just laying around in creek beds or near the surface of the soil in the areas like Central City and Blackhawk, it was really slowing down. The easy gold had been found, and if we were going to keep mining, we needed like machinery and capital. Basically, we needed capital, we needed to set up companies, we needed to start boring deep into the earth. And so mining was getting hard, and at the same time, tensions in the East were heating up because the Civil War was on the verge of breaking out. So a lot of the people who I mentioned were young men, typically. A lot of the people who came out here for the gold rush meandered back home and fought in the Civil War. And one of them was George West, who's the guy in the photo here. He's the one on the left in the uniform. I think the one on his right was his brother-in-law, who also enlisted. But George West became a captain and was first in infantry and later in cavalry. And he fought the whole 4 years in the Civil War. So during this time, Colorado in general, and Golden in particular, became very quiet. And several towns had been started during the gold rush. One of them, and several of them right here near us. This is South Table Mountain, North Table Mountain. And here's where Golden is. I hope you can see my cursor. Just north of us, at the north of Golden Gate Canyon, someone had started a city called Golden Gate City. There was another city over at 44th and McIntyre called Arapahoe City. And there was a town down in Matthews Winters Park that was called Mount Vernon. So the question is, why did our city continue to live while those other cities just kind of blew away through neglect or lack of business or lack of anything? And the answer really is William Loveland. I mentioned earlier that he had been wounded during the Mexican-American War, and so he was not going to go fight in the Civil War. He stayed here, and he made it his business to make Golden into a substantial town. Loveland's, as I said, that frame building you saw in the first earlier slide was his first store. He built the building at 12th and Washington, and that was his second store building, and that building is still there. He invested in Golden. He promoted Golden. As soon as there was any form of government that he could ask, he applied for and got a charter to build a wagon road, railway, and telegraph line through Clear Creek Canyon, which is pretty foresighted of him because the nearest railroad at this point was 600 miles away. But he knew that eventually we would develop, and he wanted the rights to go through Clear Creek Canyon, which was one of the best passes to get into the mountains to get to the gold producing towns. Let me go back, I'm sorry. Another thing that Loveland did was try very hard to make us the capital of the territory and later the state. He was in hot dispute with people from several other towns, but in the end it came down to Golden and Denver vying for it most strongly. And he offered all sorts of bribes like, come here and I will make sure that your legislators have decent accommodations, which they didn't in many other towns. I will supply whiskey and ice, which are important components in having a legislative session. And it came down to a vote between Denver and Golden, and it was a very close vote. And it was certainly understood by many at the time that the votes were bought by Denver people. Anyway, we did not become the capital. But during the time that we were the capital, we were the territorial capital, they met in the Loveland building. And that is the reason why the restaurant that's there now is called the Old Capitol Grill. So after the Civil War, George West and a few others came back, and George West started the Colorado Transcript, which eventually was renamed to be the Golden Transcript. But they've been in print since 1866. This building that's white in this picture, I'm not sure it's white nowadays, was the Colorado Transcript building for many years. And it was great for us. That he started this business. Again, because we know what was happening in 1866 and ever since. One of the things that was characteristic about journalism at this time was that it was more concerned with promotion than accuracy. One of the things he wrote in the very first Colorado Transcript was his reasons for settling in Golden. And he talked about all these wonderful things about Golden. And one of the things he said was that there was such a rushing creek going through Golden that we would be able to build manufacturing industries along every linear foot of the creek, because there was so much water power here that it could run mills, run that many mills. Which, when you think about Clear Creek, particularly in the late summer and the fall and the winter, that was really kind of a push to imagine that Clear Creek was going to power endless manufacturing, but that was the way people thought at that time. One of the buildings that was built during our territorial era was the Astor House. And you will often hear it said that the Astor House was built to house the legislators. It was built in 1867. And unfortunately for the guy who built it, Seth Lake, the territorial capital moved to Denver shortly after he finished it. So it wasn't housing legislators for the most part, but it was still a good hotel, and we still needed a good hotel. We were the capital of our county. We were the county seat. And so a lot of people still came to Golden. There were reasons to come here, and it was still a major trading hub. So the Astor House was built while we were a territory. Another building that was built at that time was the Burgess House over on 4th Street. And I show this building because there's an interesting story associated with it. The Burgesses, a pair of brothers, came out to this area with the intention of building a hotel. And so they filled their wagons with things you would need for a hotel, like blankets and pots and pans and dishes and things like that. And their wives, of course, had wardrobes, they had dresses, and they wanted to bring them. And their husbands said, you know, we really don't have room in the wagons. We need the space to put the things that we will need to start our business. And so the wives didn't want to give up their wardrobes, and so they did what was fairly common practice at the time. If they needed to carry a lot of things, they put on dress after dress after dress. They put on as many layers as they could possibly put on, and they wore their wardrobe across the plains. And if you know anything about how wagon trains work, people actually did a lot of the distance walking themselves to make it easier for their horses or oxen. And so those ladies walked, you know, about 600 miles wearing their entire wardrobe. And in later years, as those dresses started to wear out, they cut them up and they turned them into quilts. And there's one particular quilt made out of those dresses that they call the quilt that walked to Golden. And they have that quilt in the Quilt Museum. It's going to ring one more time. Oh, there we go. So things really began to turn around for Golden when we got a railroad in 1870. At that time, Golden was struggling to continue to exist. A lot of the people hadn't come back from the Civil War. Denver was trying very hard to be the only town in Colorado, you would think. And so we were in a difficult position. What we really need to put us on the map was a railroad. And we got it in 1870. And I'm going to talk about that next time. So thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Okay. Thank you so much, Barb, for a wonderful presentation. To everybody listening in today, thank you for attending. This is part of our Virtually Golden series presented by Golden United. And we will be here on Zoom at this same link every Tuesday and Thursday at noon with fun and interesting educational tidbits about Golden. Our next presenter is actually Barb again, so we're excited to have her this coming Tuesday. Barb, do you have anything else you want to say before we wrap it up?
No, I don't.
Okay, well, thank you so much everyone for coming, and we hope to see you again this coming Tuesday, tomorrow. Thanks so much, and have a good one. Good night, everybody.
Bye, thanks.
Bye.